Rex, a fearless canine who's faced down armed criminals without flinching, suddenly refused to take a single step into an old warehouse. And moments later, security footage revealed a chilling reason why. What dark secret was hidden behind those rusted doors that even a trained police dog couldn't face? Here's what happened. But before we get into the story, drop a comment below. Let us know where you're watching from. Mark sat still for a moment, his fingers tightening around the steering wheel as the cruiser's engine idled low, a dull, mechanical heartbeat against the overwhelming silence outside. His eyes darted to the looming structure ahead, Warehouse 47, a decaying monolith of rusted steel and shattered windows that seemed to breathe in the shadows, exhaling a cold unease that reached right into his gut. He glanced back at Rex, who remained pressed against the far side of the vehicle, his massive frame shivering despite the thick layers of his coat. His eyes locked on the warehouse entrance, like he could see something Mark couldn't. Something lurking, waiting. Mark swallowed hard, his law enforcement instincts clashing violently with the primal fear creeping into his thoughts. This wasn't just a bad feeling. This was something deeper, something ancient that vibrated through the marrow of his bones and left a bitter taste of dread on his tongue. He reached over and ran his hand down Rex's trembling back, his fingers brushing across the rigid muscles tense with barely restrained panic. "Easy, boy," Mark murmured, but his voice sounded foreign and thin against the heavy air. Then, as if in direct response, a light flickered within the warehouse. Just a faint pulse at first, like a dying star in the endless void. Then brighter, more erratic, dancing shadows across the broken panes like frantic silhouettes trapped behind the glass. Rex let out a low, mournful whine, his head turning away, his body curling tighter, as if to make himself invisible. Mark had faced gang shootouts, violent standoffs, and dark alleys where death waited around every corner. But nothing, not a single one of those moments, felt as suffocatingly wrong as this. He flicked on his flashlight and popped open the door, the sound unnaturally loud in the desolate space. The instant his boots hit the pavement, the air seemed to drop another 10 degrees, frost clinging to the edges of his breath, even though it was late spring. Mark moved around to Rex's door, opened it wide, expecting his partner to shake off whatever had gripped him. But instead, Rex pressed further back, his eyes locked onto Mark's with a desperate, pleading intensity. For the first time in their partnership, it wasn't the look of a soldier ready to stand by his handler's side. It was the look of a creature begging his friend not to go where nightmares lived. Mark hesitated, his fingers twitching at the handle of his holstered sidearm as the wind picked up, carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible sound. A child's laugh, distant yet unmistakable, like it was carried through time itself. His heart stuttered, the edges of his vision tightening, as he turned his head sharply toward the warehouse entrance, the door now eerily ajar, creaking softly on rusted hinges that shouldn't have moved in the windless night. And in that moment, as the light inside flickered once more, casting a sickly yellow glow onto the cracked concrete, Mark realized with bone-deep certainty, whatever waited inside that warehouse wasn't human, and tonight neither courage nor a loaded weapon might be enough to face it. Mark's every step felt heavier than the last as he crossed the threshold, the air inside the warehouse hitting him like a wall of ice-laden fog, thick and unnaturally still, wrapping around his body with an oppressive weight that seemed to push against his lungs. His flashlight beam trembled slightly, cutting through the inky black, the dust in the air swirling like a living thing, as if disturbed by unseen movement just beyond the light's reach. The beam landed on a series of old crates stacked haphazardly against the walls, their surfaces splintered and rotting with time. But it wasn't the decay that held his attention. It was the faint smears of what looked like small, grimy handprints trailing along their surfaces, as if a child had dragged their fingers across them not long ago. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his rib cage, his ears straining to hear over the blood roaring through them. And that's when it came again. A faint, almost playful giggle, impossibly close, yet nowhere in sight. Sound that didn't belong in a place long forgotten by the living. Mark swallowed against the dryness in his throat, his fingers tightening around the grip of his weapon as he pivoted toward the sound, the flashlight beam darting through the cavernous space only to reveal empty corners and gaping shadows. The giggle came again, this time from above, delicate and airy like the soft chiming of wind bells caught in a malevolent breeze, and he instinctively snapped his light upward toward the rusted catwalks. But there was nothing. Only sagging metal beams and cables dangling like skeletal fingers from the ceiling. The air grew colder still, his breath visible now in thick clouds, and a sudden, sharp crack echoed through the space, making him spin around just in time to see one of the large warehouse doors swing inward, slamming against the wall with a force that made the entire building groan. And then the whispers began. Faint, unintelligible at first, but layered, overlapping like 1,000 voices trying to speak through a broken radio, rising and falling with no clear origin. Mark turned in slow, deliberate circles, the flashlight beam slicing through the darkness, the whispers growing louder, more urgent, curling around him like invisible hands brushing against the back of his neck, cold and clammy. His mind raced to rationalize what his senses screamed was impossible. This was just an old warehouse, forgotten by time and condemned by the city, but no amount of logic could quiet the primal fear clawing at his insides. Then, through the rising cacophony of whispers, a single word broke through, clear and unmistakable. Stay. Mark froze, his eyes wide, every muscle locked in place as the flashlight flickered violently, plunging the warehouse into complete darkness for the span of a single heart-stopping breath. And in that breath, before the beam steadied again, Mark felt it, a soft, icy breath against his ear, and the unmistakable sensation of a tiny, delicate hand brushing against his own, unseen and impossibly cold. Mark's breath hitched in his throat, his ears straining against the suffocating silence that settled like a weighted blanket over the cavernous space. The faint scent of something rotten, sickly sweet and stomach-turning, crept into his nostrils, mingling with the bitter tang of rust and old oil, creating an invisible fog of decay that seemed to cling to his skin. His flashlight swept across the towering columns and forgotten machinery, the beam trembling slightly as the oppressive darkness seemed to pulse with life just beyond its reach. The footsteps had stopped, but the memory of them lingered, quick, deliberate, impossibly light, as if whatever was circling him were the tiny shoes of a child, yet moved with a predatory grace no child should possess. His finger hovered near the trigger of his sidearm, his other hand gripping the flashlight so tightly his knuckles blanched bone white. He turned slowly, the creak of his boots on the fractured floor echoing through the cavernous space like a warning, the sound swallowed almost instantly by the consuming black. His mind raced through every logical explanation. Maybe it was a vagrant, maybe kids playing some cruel prank, but those comforting thoughts dissolved as the giggle returned, soft and lilting, impossibly close to his ear despite the empty space before him. He whipped around, his heart hammering against his ribs, the flashlight beam cutting wildly through the gloom. For a split second, he thought he saw it, just a flash, tiny bare feet retreating behind a rusted support beam, their pale skin almost glowing against the darkness before vanishing out of sight. "Who's there?" Mark called, his voice cracking under the strain, the sound swallowed by the oppressive walls that seemed to press closer with every second. Another set of footsteps echoed overhead now, faster this time, racing along the rusted catwalks above, followed by the high-pitched tinkling sound of something metallic falling and skittering across the floor just a few feet from him. He jerked the flashlight downward and saw it. A small, battered toy soldier, its plastic body melted and misshapen, one hollow eye socket, staring up at him from the grime-caked floor. His blood ran cold. He remembered that toy. It was mentioned in the old case files, part of the evidence recovered after the children disappeared 2 decades ago. But how was it here now, looking as though it had just been dropped? The temperature plummeted again, his breath hanging visibly in the air as the whispers returned, louder this time, layered and urgent, though still unintelligible. Then came the footsteps again, this time from every direction, closing in, faster and faster, till it felt as if dozens of tiny feet were circling him, unseen but all too present. And then, just as suddenly, everything stopped. The whispers ceased, the footsteps vanished. The only sound was his own ragged breathing. Then a final giggle echoed above him, and with a sickening creak, something heavy shifted in the rafters. Slowly, his flashlight beam followed the sound upward, and there, swaying gently from a frayed length of rope, was a child's broken swing, hanging where no swing should ever have been, twisting slowly in the icy air as if someone had just leapt from it and disappeared into the darkness. The flashlight's beam trembled as Mark struggled to keep, his breathing under control, his mind clawing through faded memories to piece together details he should have left buried. The case file hadn't seemed significant at the time. A tattered manila folder shoved to the back of the archives, its edges yellowed and curling as if the contents themselves wanted to be forgotten. 3 children. Emily Carson, age 6. Tyler Briggs, age 7. And Madison Hale, age 5. They had come here on a dare, a foolish childhood challenge to spend one night inside the infamous Warehouse 47, and they were never seen again. Search teams combed every inch of the building for days, but there had been no sign of them. No bodies, no trace. Just that single blood-stained teddy bear found near the entrance. Its left eye missing, its faded pink fur matted and stiff with something dark and dried. Officially, the department had written it off as a runaway case that turned tragic somewhere else. The warehouse cleared of any suspicion, but those who worked the case back then never quite looked the same afterward. Mark remembered the haunted look in the eyes of retired Officer John Mallory, who once muttered after one too many drinks and that he still heard the children's voices when he tried to sleep, soft whispers and far-off laughter that never quite faded with the years. Mark shook his head, trying to dispel the memory, but the oppressive air in the warehouse pressed closer, almost as if the building itself was remembering too, as if its steel beams and crumbling walls were soaked in the echoes of that terrible night. His flashlight flicked briefly, the cone of light stuttering before settling again. And that's when he saw it. Directly beneath the swaying child's swing, etched into the dust-covered floor, 3 small handprints arranged in a perfect circle, their impressions disturbingly fresh against the grime of decades. He crouched down slowly, his free hand trembling as he hovered it just above the prints, feeling the faintest lingering warmth radiating from them. A warmth that shouldn't be there, not in this freezing tomb of forgotten horrors. A sudden, sharp clatter echoed behind him, and he spun around, his sidearm raised, his flashlight beam darting wildly across the space until it landed on something that made his blood run colder than the night air. There, propped against a rusted support beam, was the teddy bear. The same bear from the case file, its one remaining eye staring directly at him. The faded pink fur, now a grim, almost brown hue under the grime, and in the center of its chest, a dark stain that seemed almost wet, as if the blood had only just dried. Mark took a hesitant step back, his mind screaming for him to leave, to run and never look back. But his feet felt glued to the cracked concrete as the sound of children's laughter echoed once more through the darkness. Closer this time, circling, always circling. And above it all, a soft, melodic voice sang a lullaby long forgotten by the living. Its gentle, haunting notes drifting through the warehouse like a funeral hymn for souls that never found their way home. Mark's breath came in ragged bursts as he stumbled out into the cold night air, his chest burning from the sudden sprint. But the sharp sting of exhaustion was nothing compared to the ice that gripped his spine when his eyes landed on Rex. The massive German shepherd stood completely still, his muscles locked tight, his head tilted upward, eyes locked on the second floor windows like a statue carved from living stone. His ears were pinned back flat against his skull, his thick fur bristling along his spine. And the low guttural growl vibrating from deep within his chest wasn't one of aggression. It was fear, raw and unfiltered. Mark followed the line of Rex's gaze with dread coiling in his gut, his heart slamming against his ribs like a battering ram trying to break free from his chest. And then he saw it, framed perfectly by the shattered remains of the second-story window. A small, pale figure standing utterly still, its face obscured by the shadows, but its silhouette unmistakable. The child was impossibly still, hands pressed against the cracked glass, the faint outline of delicate fingers barely visible in the flickering glow of the malfunctioning overhead lights inside. Mark felt the air grow colder with every passing second, his breath now a thick fog curling in front of his face, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on him from every direction. His instincts screamed at him to look away, to turn back, but he couldn't. His feet were rooted in place as the child tilted its head ever so slightly, a slow, deliberate motion that felt utterly unnatural, the kind of movement that didn't belong to anything living. Then, as if responding to some silent command, the lights inside the warehouse flickered violently, bathing the entire structure in strobing flashes of sickly yellow and deep shadow. For a moment, in the staccato burst of light and darkness, Mark thought he saw not one child, but three, standing side by side at the window, their hollow eyes locked onto his from the darkness above, their mouths slowly parting as if to speak. A high-pitched, almost electrical whine filled the air, so sharp and sudden that Mark winced in pain, clapping a hand to his ear as the sound pierced through the night like a siren from another world. And then, just as quickly as it began, the lights died completely, plunging the warehouse into absolute darkness. The figures at the windows swallowed by the void. Rex let out a sharp, distressed bark and lunged forward against the leash again, his body trembling with a fear Mark had never seen in the seasoned K9 before. Mark's mind raced, his vision narrowing as the crushing sense of wrongness settled around him like a thick, suffocating fog. He reached for his radio, his fingers numb against the cold metal, but all he heard was static, a low, that hissing whisper that almost sounded like a voice beneath the distortion, repeating a word over and over so faintly he could barely make it out. Stay. 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 Mark dropped radio, his pulse a frantic drumbeat in his ears, as the warehouse door behind him groaned open once more, the unseen force within beckoning him back into the dark, where the whispers waited and the forgotten dead were not quite as forgotten as everyone had hoped. Mark pressed on, each step into the darkness heavier than the last, his flashlight flickering weakly, as if struggling against the suffocating black that seemed to pulse and breathe around him. The trail of tiny wet footprints glistened under the trembling beam, leading him through narrow corridors choked with forgotten machinery and decaying crates that loomed like silent sentinels over secrets best left buried. The oppressive air seemed to hum with an unnatural static, and every breath felt like inhaling ice-laden fog that bit at his lungs and made his vision swim. His boots slipped slightly on the slick floor, his heart pounding louder than his footsteps as that soft giggle echoed again, impossibly close, curling around him like a whispered dare in the dark. He swung the flashlight wildly, its narrow beam slicing through the shadows to reveal fleeting glimpses of something just out of reach. A small shape darting behind a row of rusted lockers, a pale hand disappearing around a corner. Every time he thought he might catch up, the footprints veered away, leading him deeper into the heart of the warehouse, where the walls seemed to close in and the air grew colder still. The giggle came again, higher this time, laced with something unsettling, something cruel and knowing, and it sent a fresh wave of goosebumps racing across his skin. Mark stumbled into a larger room, its ceiling barely holding under the weight of years of decay, and that's when he saw it. Standing in the center of the room was the same child-sized figure, motionless once more, his head bowed low so that only a curtain of tangled, matted hair was visible. He raised his weapon, his voice hoarse as he called out, "Stay where you are!" But the figure didn't flinch, didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. His flashlight's flickering beam trembled across the thin, pale arms hanging limply at its sides, the delicate fingers twitching in a slow, almost rhythmic motion. And then, with agonizing slowness, the child's head lifted. Mark's breath froze in his throat as hollow black eyes locked onto his, eyes that seemed impossibly deep, as if they weren't eyes at all, but endless pits into nothingness. The corners of the child's mouth curled upward in a slow, unnatural smile that stretched too wide, the pale skin cracking like old parchment as if it hadn't been used in decades. Before he could react, the lights above exploded in a shower of sparks, plunging the room into utter darkness as the giggle erupted all around him, now multiplied, coming from every corner, every wall, above him, below him, inside him. Panic clawed at his chest as he spun in the dark, trying to track the sounds that seemed to circle him faster and faster, the air alive with unseen movement and the oppressive weight of something ancient and unforgiving. And then, silence. Utter, suffocating silence. The flashlight buzzed weakly back to life, and as the beam flickered on, the footprints had vanished, replaced by a single message smeared across the wall in wet, crimson strokes. "You found us. Now stay." Mark stood frozen at the threshold, his heart hammering against his ribs with such force he was sure it echoed through the walls of that impossible room. The air inside was unnaturally still, dense with the scent of faded innocence and something darker, something metallic and unmistakably fresh. His flashlight beam trembled as it swept over the scene before him, the circle of dim light revealing fragments of a forgotten childhood, tiny porcelain dolls with cracked faces smiling through missing eyes, a rusted tricycle with its front wheel twisted at an unnatural angle, and building blocks spelling out words that seemed to shift when he tried to read them. But it was the music box that drew his attention next, its haunting melody playing a slow, distorted lullaby that seemed to reverberate directly against his skull, the notes bending and warping like they were struggling to hold onto a song that had long since died. It sat atop a small wooden table near the corner of the room, its once bright paint now flaking away like dead skin, and its ballerina figure twisted grotesquely, frozen in a broken pirouette. Mark's light crept lower to the center of the room, and there it was, the teddy bear. The same one from the case file, its matted fur clumped with something dark and sticky, the single remaining glass eye glinting like a cold, lifeless star. Beside it, smeared across the warped floorboards, were small handprints etched in what could only be fresh blood. The red stark and vivid against the faded wood, still wet enough to glisten under the beam of his light. His stomach clenched as a fresh wave of nausea threatened to overtake him. But before he could turn away, the temperature in the room dropped so suddenly that his breath poured out in heavy clouds. The flashlight flickered again, the shadows deepening, and with each sputtering burst of light, it felt as though the toy shifted, edging closer to him without ever seeming to move. The lullaby grew louder, discordant and broken, the warped notes twisting into something almost like a voice humming along. Mark stepped back, his boot creaking against the ancient floorboards, and the sound seemed to trigger something. The music box slowed, the tune grinding to a halt with a final, agonized note that hung in the air like a dying breath. And then the room fell into absolute silence. Mark's skin prickled as he heard it. A soft, deliberate inhale, not his own, coming from directly behind him. His muscles locked, every instinct screaming at him not to turn. But the compulsion was stronger. Slowly, agonizingly, he pivoted, the flashlight's dying beam revealing the faint outline of three small figures standing just inside the doorway he had entered through, their eyes glimmering faintly in the darkness like twin stars swallowed by a void. And then, as one, they smiled, wide, unnatural, and full of a terrible knowing. And the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls, plunging Mark into the waiting dark. Mark stumbled backward, his hand clutching at his chest where a searing, invisible force pressed against him like the crushing weight of 1,000 regrets made manifest. His breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, his vision swimming as the room seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The faded wallpaper, bleeding dark patterns that twisted and slithered like veins through rotted plaster. The child's figure remained motionless, her lifeless eyes fixed on him with a depthless void that seemed to draw the very light from the air. Her tiny pale fingers still outstretched, the accusation in her gesture, heavier than any words she might have spoken. The other two figures emerged from the shadows now, their small feet soundless against the warped floor, their faces identical masks of hollow innocence, marred by something ancient and unforgiving. The air grew so cold that Mark's fingers numbed, his skin turning pale under the frost that crept along the floor like living mist, curling over his boots, climbing his legs in a slow, inevitable crawl. He tried to raise his weapon, but his arm felt leaden, his movements sluggish as if the very will to fight was being siphoned away by the oppressive presence in the room. The whisper came again, louder this time, layered and echoing, as though spoken by 1,000 unseen mouths hidden just behind the walls. Stay and play. Stay and play. The words pulsed with an unnatural rhythm that matched the frantic beat of his heart, each syllable a hammer blow against his sanity. His mind flashed back to the old case files, the newspaper clippings, the grainy black and white photos of three missing children whose faces were forever frozen in innocent smiles, their eyes bright with dreams that would never be fulfilled. And now here they stood before him, not as they were, but as they had become, something far removed from the warmth of life, something forged from years of forgotten sorrow and restless rage. The room began to spin, the toys on the floor rattling violently as if caught in a rising storm of unseen energy. The music box's broken ballerina spinning wildly on its twisted bass, despite the absence of music. Mark fell to one knee, his vision tunneling to a pinprick of light surrounded by endless dark. His pulse thudding loud and slow in his ears. The girl stepped closer, her tiny feet leaving bloody footprints that steamed against the icy floor, her voice a ragged whisper that seemed to come from inside his head. You found us. Now you're ours. With a final effort of will, Mark reached for his chest, yanking free the chain that held his father's old service cross. The tarnished silver catching what little light remained. The instant the cross glinted in the dark, the children froze, their hollow eyes widening in something that almost resembled fear. The oppressive weight lifted just enough for Mark to gasp a breath, his hand trembling as he pressed the cold metal against his chest, the burning pain ebbing slightly under its touch. But the children didn't vanish. They stood there, watching, waiting, their haunting lullaby beginning again, slow and deliberate, as if this game was far from over and the night had only just begun. Mark collapsed onto the cold pavement outside, his body trembling from the unseen grip that had nearly pulled him into oblivion, his lungs dragging in ragged, freezing breaths that burned his throat. Above him, Rex stood tall and unyielding, his body planted firmly between his handler and the yawning darkness of the warehouse. His powerful frame quivering with restrained fury, his teeth bared and glinting, under the sickly glow of the last remaining exterior light. The warehouse loomed before them, silent now, its windows nothing more than black, vacant eyes staring back with malignant intent. But even as the building seemed to settle into its ominous stillness, Mark could feel it. Whatever evil had stirred within those walls wasn't gone. It was watching, waiting. Rex's ears twitched, his body tense as a low, almost inaudible growl vibrated from his chest. His gaze locked on the entrance, as if daring whatever lurked within to step beyond that threshold. Mark tried to rise, his muscles weak and unresponsive, but Rex pressed his broad head against Mark's shoulder, a silent command to stay down, to rest, as if the loyal canine understood that his human was far too broken to fight anymore. And then, without warning, the air shifted, a bone-deep cold sweeping out from the warehouse like a living shadow stretching its fingers into the night. The darkness at the entrance thickened, writhing like smoke, and from within came the soft, dreadful sound of a child's lullaby carried on a breeze that should not have existed. Rex's body tensed further, his growl rising into a ferocious snarl as he took a step forward, his massive form a living shield between Mark and the nightmare beyond. Mark struggled to sit up, his vision still hazy, his heart aching with a new kind of fear. One not for himself, but for the brave creature standing ready to give everything for him. "Rex, no," he croaked, his voice barely audible, his hand reaching weakly toward the loyal shepherd. But Rex didn't turn. His entire being was focused on the darkness, and as that terrible lullaby grew louder, the shadow at the entrance seemed to pulse, a faint, ghostly silhouette beginning to form, its hollow eyes gleaming with unnatural light. With a final, defiant bark that seemed to shake the ground beneath them, Rex lunged forward, charging directly into the encroaching shadow, his powerful jaws snapping at the formless evil that dared to claim his handler. The darkness recoiled, the silhouette dissolving into a shriek so piercing that the windows of the warehouse shattered inward, the glass raining down like jagged black rain. Mark's vision blurred as the pressure in the air broke all at once, the unnatural chill replaced by the first breath of warm spring air he'd felt all night. And just like that, the darkness withdrew, the shadows retreating into the broken remains of the warehouse, the lullaby fading into a final, lingering note that hung in the air before silence consumed everything. Rex returned to Mark's side, his powerful chest heaving, his eyes still locked on the darkened entrance, and though his body trembled with exhaustion, he stood tall, unbowed, the living embodiment of loyalty forged through fire and fear. And in that moment, Mark knew, whatever they had faced tonight, it wasn't over. But thanks to Rex's sacrifice, they had lived to see the dawn. The footage began like any routine patrol recording, the timestamp glowing faintly in the corner as Mark's shaky flashlight cut through the gloom of Warehouse 47, the beam catching on broken crates and rusted steel as the low hum of static crackled faintly over the audio. At first, nothing seemed unusual beyond the decrepit state of the building. But then came the first sound, a faint, childlike giggle so soft it barely registered over the recording's low hum, and that's when the thermal imaging picked up the impossible. 3 cold signatures moved in perfect synchrony through the shadows, their forms small, unmistakably child-sized, and yet their temperatures registered far below anything living. The department techs replayed that section over and over, the figures darting just beyond the reach of Mark's light, always circling, always watching. Then the body cam caught it, a clear, harrowing image of the girl standing beneath the shattered swing, her pale face tilted slightly, those hollow eyes glowing faintly as if lit from within by some malevolent force beyond understanding. She stood motionless as the lullaby began to play, that sickeningly sweet, broken melody filling the air. And in the final frame before the feed dissolved into a wall of static, the girl turned her head slowly toward the lens, her mouth stretching into a wide, unnatural smile that seemed to split her face far too wide, and then darkness. The security footage from the warehouse cameras, only deepened the horror. One feed captured Rex's desperate barking outside, his powerful body lunging against the leash as his eyes fixed on something unseen in the upper windows. Then, in a flickering sequence of grainy frames, the figure of the child appeared at the second-story window, her translucent hands pressed against the glass, her head tilting in slow, jerky motions that made veteran officers physically recoil from the screen. And in that final moment, before the cameras went dark, the child's eyes seemed to lock directly onto the lens, and she raised her hand in a slow wave, as if bidding farewell or promising a return. Within hours of the footage surfacing, it spread like wildfire across every media outlet and social platform, sparking debates that blurred the lines between myth and reality. Paranormal investigators, skeptics, and religious leaders flooded the airwaves, each offering their explanations. But none could deny what their eyes had seen, and yet, through all the noise and endless speculation, Mark and Rex remained silent. They didn't need theories or debates. They had stood in the presence of something ancient and restless, something that defied logic and reason. Even now, nights after the encounter, Mark found himself waking in a cold sweat to the faintest echoes of that twisted lullaby drifting through his mind. And Rex, brave, loyal Rex, slept with his body curled protectively near the door, his ears twitching at every whisper of wind, his eyes opening often to scan the darkened corners of the room as if expecting those small, pale figures to emerge once more from the shadows. And though the warehouse had since been sealed, condemned, and fenced off under the highest security, Mark knew the truth. Some doors, once opened, never truly close. And somewhere, beneath the crumbling bones of Warehouse 47, the forgotten still waited, their lullaby floating faintly through the empty halls, waiting for the next soul, brave or foolish enough to enter.